Hey everyone, Lisel Crowley here at the Cool Tools Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make a really cool adjustable ring using EZ960 clay and a beautiful nano gem. Let's get started. So for this project we're going to use EZ960 clay, and it really doesn't take a lot of clay. I would say maybe 5 to 7 grams to make a ring. We're going to use a nano gem. These are just some of the examples of the beautiful colors that they come in. I actually am going to use this tourmaline color, and these are fantastic because they don't change color in the firing, and they really give a lot of flash and sparkle in the finished product. We're going to use biopsy punches to set the stones. You want to have a clay board, these fantastic textures. This is the particular texture I used for this ring. You can see these are called easy release textures, and I absolutely love them. The clay releases beautifully from them, and it gives you a really, really precise, defined design. And it comes in a variety of textures you can mix and match to your heart's content. We're going to need a clay roller. I really like this larger clay roller. Thickness frames, a coil roller, a clay keeper, and you can use the clay keeper to keep your clay hydrated as you're working by putting it upside down over a tough card. Ring mandrels for sizing, a ring sizer, lubricant, cool slip, distilled water, a cup of water and a brush, some tough cards, the ultra clay pick, which as you know by now is my favorite metal clay tool ever, a Sharpie, and a measuring tape. Let's get started. So the first thing you want to consider whenever you're making a ring is the size of the ring, and you always want to take into account shrinkage. These rings do overlap, and they are adjustable, but you still want to get your size fairly close to what you want your finished ring to be. So the first thing you want to do is determine the actual ring size you want to make. And you can use a ring sizer for that. I happen to know that I want to make a size 7 ring. I often make size 7 rings as that's a very common size. So when you are making a ring with metal clay, you have to take into account shrinkage. I find that EZ960 shrinks around 10%, so I go up 2 to 2.5 to 3 sizes, depending on how loose I want the ring to be. The wider the ring, the more of a size difference you want, because the wider ring is going to need a little bit more extra room to get on and off. So if I want a size 7 ring, I want to either measure a size 9 mandrel or a size 10 mandrel. I happen to have a size 9 mandrel here, so that's what I'm going to use, and I'll end up with more like a 6.5 to a 7 ring. But again, these are adjustable, so it's not as picky as it would be if you were making a non-adjustable ring. So what I want to do, because we're making these rings flat, is measure the circumference of the size 9 mandrel. And I'm just going to take my tape measure, and I come out at right around 2.5. And now I don't pull this really tight. It's really more like 2 and 3/8. But you want to allow for the overlap. So I'm going to call it 2 5/8. So I've determined that I need my ring to be 2 5/8 inches long in order to be the size I want after firing. So I'm just going to take my tough card. My tape measure is being ornery here. And I'm going to put a little tick mark with a Sharpie at 2 5/8. Okay, so this is the length I need my ring to be. So the first thing I want to do is create the setting for my stone. And the reason we want to do that is that I want that setting dried and sanded before I actually set it into the ring. And I do want to, when I make the ring, cut a hole in the ring itself so that the light will come through and the stone will sparkle nicely and the color will be easy to view after the piece is fired. So to set the stone, the first thing I want to do is determine the depth of the stone. And to do that, I'll take my frames, and I'm going to start with a size 8 frame, an 8 card frame, and take my coil roller and run it over the stone. And you see the stone is moving. That means I'm not deep enough. Let me add a number 2. And now I am deep enough. So this is the perfect size for the stone setting. I'm going to take a tough card, and I want to create my setting on the tough card so that I don't have to pick it up after I've made it. Okay, so now what I want to do is take a wad of nice fresh clay, and you want your clay to be fresh or freshly reconstituted for this because you tend to stretch the clay a little when you create the bezel. And I'm going to roll it into a ball using my coil roller. I want to avoid handling it with my hands as much as possible because my hands will pull moisture out of the clay and the coil roller won't. I'm also going to create my bezel on a tough card so that once I've created it, I don't have to disturb it. Now I'm going to take my coil roller and press to create a patty. Okay, so that stuck a little on the one side, so I'm just going to flip it over. The other thing I want to do at this point, I don't know if you can see these fine little cracks on the surface. I am going to go ahead and moisten this clay because we don't want it to get too dried out as we work. So the first thing I want to do is use a biopsy punch to cut the outer shape of the bezel. And these biopsy punches come in a variety of sizes from 2.5 millimeters up to 10 millimeters. This one that I'm using here is an 8 millimeter. And they're great because they have no seam, so they cut a perfect circle. But it's important that you lube it so that the clay doesn't stick. So I've sprayed some cool slip on my edge of my work surface, and I'm just going to dip my biopsy punch in that. And then I'm going to take a brush with some cool slip and brush the inside. And this is because we want that clay to release nicely. So I'm going to press straight down and twist and pull straight up and see how the clay stays behind. Now I'm going to cut away that excess. And I find it's important to leave your finger on the clay as you're pulling away the excess. Always return your clay to the hydrator so it doesn't dry out. Now I'm going to press down on this to flatten it. It's a little wet on the surface, so I'm just going to rub a little bit of cool slip on my coil roller before I press. And that will keep it from sticking. So I'm going to cut the hole for the stone using this 3.5 millimeter biopsy punch. The stone I'm using is 4 millimeters, and I want the hole to be slightly smaller than the stone. I am going to lube the outside of it, but I'm not going to lube the inside of it because I want the clay pellet to come out with the biopsy punch for that inner hole. I'm going to center it by eye, cut straight down, twist, and pull straight up. I'm going to remove the excess clay with my clay pick. And this is to reuse the clay, but also to keep your biopsy punch nice and clean. And it's a little tricky to get all that clay out of there, but you can get most of it out. And now you can see that my bezel's slightly distorted, so I'm just going to kind of push it together and then take my coil roller and press again. Now I'm going to actually put the stone in. I'm going to pick up my stone and just set it gently on there. All I want is to set it on there. I'm not trying to push it down with anything. And now, keeping my guides in place, I'm just going to press again with the coil roller. And what that does is it seats the stone in there nice and level. The girdle of the stone is underneath the surface of the clay, so as the clay shrinks, it's going to grab onto it, and it's not going to go anywhere. So this will be set aside to dry, it will be sanded, and then I'll make the ring. So because I'm making a long and narrow piece for a ring, I'm going to start by rolling a fat log using my coil roller. And I want to get it, whoops, the clay is running away from me. I want to get it just roughly a little bit longer than I need it to be. And then I'm going to use my 5-card frame and flatten it down to roughly 5 cards thick. To be sure that I've got it 5 cards thick, I'm going to use my frame and my rolling pin and complete that rolling process. I just find it's easier to start with a log than to start with a sheet of clay. Now I'm going to texture. So to lubricate these textures, you don't need a lot of lube, which is great because it doesn't contaminate the clay. So I'm just going to lube from a distance, a very light mist, and then spread that around. And I want to capture 2 rows of this design. So I want to lay my clay down and roll in a direction that will allow me to get 2 rows. And I'm texturing down to 3 cards thick. The reason I'm going this thick is because it's a ring, and I want it to have enough substance so that when I go to bend it afterwards, it's good and strong. Always a nice firm pass when you texture. And look at how nice that texture comes out and how easily it releases. So I'm going to place this on my pre-measured tough card. And the first thing I want to do is cut it down to length. So I'm going to use that little tick mark of the Sharpie and trim it. Now the next step is to cut around the design. And you see there's a thicker line there that defines the design. I'm going to very carefully cut around that. And I want one end of the ring to have the point because that makes it look good when it's overlapping. So I'm going to start on this side where the point is. And I'm going to cut carefully. And notice how I'm anchoring the clay with my finger. That's so it doesn't move around as I'm cutting. And this clay pick is the best tool for this. It cuts through the clay like butter. Now, you can see it's kind of ragged, but that can be fixed when I sand. So that's not anything to be concerned about. I'd rather have it be a little ragged than cut away too much. And you see how I go in stages? That's to make it less likely that I'm going to cut away more than I need to. Now, the next step is to put my stone in. And I like the stone to go on the part that's going to overlap on the front. So on this particular ring, I have it set in a little further than on this ring. This one's a little closer to the end. But wherever I want to set it, I want to make a hole for the stone. So I want to come back in with my 2.5 millimeter cutter. I'm just going to kind of place my stone and see where I think I might like it to be. And I'm going to put it right in that general vicinity there. So I'm going to cut my hole. Now in this case, I didn't worry about lubricating the biopsy punch because I knew it would come out cleanly, and I'm going to clean out the inside of the punch anyway. And the next thing I'm going to do is wet the back of my stone very generously. Sometimes I'll use tweezers for this. Sometimes I'll even take my stone and just dip it in the water and then place it right where I want it to go. Apply a little bit of pressure, and I will sort of just lightly wiggle it until it grabs. Now that's basically the ring design. It's going to go in the dehydrator or be air dried. I am going to trim down right here. I don't like that sharp edge, so I'm just going to trim that down. This will be dried either, again, air dried by dehydrator, however you want to dry it. We'll do a final sanding, clean off the gemstone, and then fire it, and then I'll show you how to shape it after firing. So here's the ring after it's been dried and sanded, and I just want you to see how I've somewhat rounded this edge off, and I made sure I kind of rounded that tip off. That's because you don't want any sharpness after it's fired. And I also want you to take note of the hole in the back for the stone. That's to allow for light so that the stone will sparkle nicely. The final step I'm going to do before firing is clean the stone off with alcohol. And you want to make sure you do a really thorough job of this because if there's any silver clay residue on that stone, it won't sparkle. It'll have a film on it. So if any of you have issues with stones coming out of the kiln with a white film, it's most likely because you didn't clean it off thoroughly. And once it's completely cleaned off, it can go be fired according to the firing schedule for EZ960. I find that my favorite schedule for EZ960 in my kiln, which has been tested, is to ramp at full speed to 675, hold for 15 minutes to allow the binder to burn out completely, then ramp at full speed to 1675 and hold for 2 hours. But again, I've tested my kiln and I make sure that that firing schedule works and my pieces come out perfectly every time. Okay, so the ring has been fired and it's ready to bend. So the first thing we're going to do is bend the ring, and we want to bend it fresh out of the kiln. We don't want to do anything else to it because we want it nice and soft. So here's the fired piece and it's ready to bend. But before I bend it, I always like to do a water test to check for surface sintering. If it's not surface sintered, then it's not sintered all the way through and I won't bend it. So the way I do the water test, I'm going to do it on the back where the clay is smooth. I'm just going to take a drop of water and drop it on there. And see how the water is flowing over the surface and sitting on the surface? That's what you want. If the piece soaks the water in, that means it's not sintered. But because it's sitting on the surface, I know that the clay is at least surface sintered and most likely sintered all the way through. So to bend the ring, I'm going to use the mandrel in the size that I actually want. Remember when we measured the size we wanted to make the ring in, we went 2 to 3 sizes larger. But for actually bending, I want a size 7, so I'm using the size 7 mandrel. And I start bending by hand. And you may have noticed that I have not brushed the metal yet. And the reason for that is even brushing will start to work harden the silver. And again, we want it as soft as possible while we're doing the bending. So I'll get it partially bent and then I'll use a rawhide mallet to finish it. And there we have the ring. I love the way that this taper overlaps here. You could adjust the size slightly. You could go up to a size 8 possibly by pulling it apart, down to a size 6. I'm pretty much a size 7. It fits me just right. And the next step is to brush it and polish it and patina it. Let me just give it a quick brush so you can see how nice it looks. I prefer a steel brush when I brush metal clay. I don't need to use water or anything with it, and I think it works a little faster than brass. I think brass is a little softer, so it takes a little longer, and I'm kind of an impatient girl. So typically what I do is I'll tumble them, patina them, and then bring it down to a satin finish, but you could finish it any way you like. And there we have our lovely finished ring. So here we have 3 different iterations of this ring, and I love it because you can really change it up with slight changes. For instance, on this one, it kind of rests side by side instead of overlapping, which gives you a slightly different look. And of course, the stone is positioned in a slightly different place. This one, there's just a little blunter edge on it, different colored stone. And of course, this is the one I just made. The stone's a little bit larger, but you can really play around with it. You can even overlap it a lot more and have a different look that way. You could also wear it with this side showing. There's lots of different variety you can get with this ring. This is a really fun project. I hope you have a lot of joy making them.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.